mind bend, non-ordinary and extraordinary states of consciousness for mind bend creative.
Hannah, what do you think people don't understand about psychedelics? I know that's an unfair and very broad question, but if you had to answer that question, if it was posed to you on a podcast, what do you think people don't understand about psychedelics?
I think, especially right now, is there's a lot more mainstream focus on psychedelics. The biggest thing that I'm noticing is it's not actually so much about the substance itself, that it's a lot more about the container, the whole experience, what you're seeking out of it. There's a lot more, varying aspects to what someone's going to get out of a psychedelic experience than just the actual psychedelic of choice.
There's a lot of different psychedelics, aren't there?
There are, yeah.
Yeah. And would you say that a person's capable of having a psychedelic experience without ingesting a psychedelic compound?
Definitely.
Yeah. Tell me more about how somebody would go about having a psychedelic experience without taking what's commonly referred to as a psychedelic.
Well, a lot of what I look at is more through the lens of altered states of consciousness. Yeah. So that kind of correlates into a psychedelic state of consciousness. People can get that through, breath work, through dancing. If you have a high fever, you might, be in a psychedelic state to a certain degree. In dreams, through intense emotional experiences. So I think that, there's quite a few ways to access that altered state.
Altered states of consciousness. So typically when you wake up in the morning or when you're preparing breakfast or getting ready for the day or going to work or dealing with children or whatever, there's a set of rules that you're playing by, right? You have to function, you have to get from point A to point B to point C, you have to accomplish tasks. We're talking about a zone of being and of mindfulness that's different than your normal waking routine. Psychedelic seems to be referred to that experience when it's been colored by something specific, a number of compounds, whether they're naturally occurring or fabricated, that alters the way that you perceive your own experience. But you teach people in an environment in which they're already shaking up their normal experience, right? There's an intimidation factor, I think, to even going to a yoga class. And you are an experienced, studied yoga practitioner and teacher. And when I learned that you were integrating plant medicine into your practice, it was one of the first times I'd heard of someone who was actively bringing that into the studio. So I really wanted to give you a chance today to share with us about what you've learned in deciding to practice this way.
Absolutely. A big part of it started with my own personal practice. I grew up studying dance and grew up in San Francisco, so was exposed to the cannabis plant at a relatively young age. It was very sort of normalized within San Francisco culture. When I was turning 18, there were a lot of cannabis clubs where you could get, a medical recommendation and be able to have access to buying the cannabis plant. So kind of early on, I had a curiosity about it. And it was really through my own movement practice that I found it to be a really supportive plant for that practice.
We're talking about cannabis specifically.
Yeah. So I was using it myself as a way to explore different elements of myself within a yoga practice or even just movement, dance, connecting to music, alleviating pain or inflammation in my body. And so I started to recognize that I wasn't the only one doing that within other yoga instructors or yoga practitioners. And so I wanted to create a space where people felt safe to explore that together. So that was really the birth of Lit Yoga as a studio or as a hub where people could come and experience that. And one of the biggest learnings from that has been that it's so unique for everyone. It's going to look different. The experience isn't, there are certain key takeaways that you can kind of explore over different people's journey with it, but it's a really individual experience in a lot of ways.
How did you first start to use cannabis doing yoga? Like, what you decided that you'd get high before a class one time and see how it felt, and I use the term "get high" crassly, but
Yeah. I was exploring that in college mostly, but it was not so much like getting high and going to a public class, but getting high and moving around, in my room, doing stretches and working out muscles and, working through fascia and all those kinds of things, more just in my own time. And I realized that my awareness of my body, my awareness of my breath, how I felt after was noticeably different than doing those things without the influence of cannabis.
Tell me more about that, if you could remember.
Yeah. I like to explain it it's almost like you have like a microscope over the body or over the mind or over the breath. I feel like cannabis kind of like zones in on an experience in a way. Mm. So it was really, things could be felt more intensely or felt more deeply. It was easier to sort of quiet the monkey mind or the chatter in the brain, and really be in a fully embodied presence. Connection to breath was a very noticeable difference. And I found that once I opened Lit Yoga and had students in classes, the way students were breathing in those classes compared to kind of any yoga studio that you might go to, was vastly different.
It's so different for me because smoking pot has always had the opposite effect. It's never calmed me or silenced the monkey mind or made me feel open or embodied in a comfortable way. Mm-hmm. I can't smoke because it goes right to anxiety and depression, filling my head with way too many thoughts at once in an overwhelming way, fixating on things that are uncomfortable to be fixated on. There's an impediment to my own doing yoga to begin with because it's intimidating to me in a way that I don't really understand. I don't think embodiment is a very natural state for me. I don't feel at peace with having a human body, really. I feel like a body is more of an encumberment to what I really want to be. And so just showing up to yoga, maybe it's the stillness. I don't think I have a problem with sitting and meditating, but there's some kind of pressure with yoga that's always intimidating to me. And then the idea of introducing pot to that just feels like a nightmare.
Yeah, that's fair. I don't think you're alone in that experience. And I think we live in a really disembodied world as a whole. I think a lot of people are really uncomfortable when they drop into their physical presence. And I think that's due to, a series of evolution over time where we've really prioritized the mind and prioritized intelligence, not intelligence of the body, but intelligence of what we can think or, how we can, cognitively be able to understand the world. And I think the body invites us into this kinesthetic awareness or this sensory awareness that, if for years, say you went to school and you sat in class and, you're supposed to sit still in your chair. If you have a thought, you have to raise your hand. You have to wait to be called on. A lot of sort of the natural bodily instincts are in some ways carved out of us, I think, over time, just through the way our world is set up. And so I think that can make it very uncomfortable when we do drop in, because you can almost think of it like there's all these messages that have been coming through the body for so many years that have been silenced or ignored or kind of turned down, that then when you go to drop into that space, it makes sense that it would feel, anxiety producing or overwhelming, or heavy potentially, because it's emotions live in our sensory being. And so when we haven't spent time to kind of be with that emotional body or the energetic body, it makes sense that as soon as you go there, it's going to feel like a lot.
Do people come to you needing to use yoga as a way to transcend some kind of suffering or heal from something in particular? What are some strong anecdotes from your experience where people have come to the practice with a specific purpose, like healing from something in mind?
Yeah, I think that's a high majority of the people that have been curious about bringing plant medicine into their yoga practice, because they're either people that have explored yoga or other methods of healing and haven't maybe had as much breakthrough as they were looking for, or people that have zero experience with it, but the cannabis piece or the weed piece is kind of their entry point. So for some people that smoke regularly, or that's, consuming cannabis is sort of a part of their life, it was really interesting to see how that sometimes was the pathway to get someone into a yoga class for the first time, because it was like, oh, you can get high and do this. And they're like, oh, I like to get high, or I do that already. But then now they're having this deeper, type of experience with cannabis and, with the practices. Yeah.
What are people saying to you after practicing like this for the first time, or maybe after they've been doing it for a little while? Like, what's their takeaway from the integration of using plant medicine with the practice?
A big thing that I've heard many times is that some of the dialogue that tends to come up around self-judgment or judgment of the body, judgment of their experience while they're in it, gets dialed down. That was always the one that felt the most consistent across a lot of our students. So, and, we offer a teacher training. So we train other yoga teachers, or even just yoga students that are curious about working with plant medicine or working with cannabis. And one of the practices in the teacher training is to do a very specific yoga practice without any influence of anything, and then consume cannabis and do the exact same practice right after, and kind of like a compare and contrast. So that's been really interesting for the teachers that have gone through the training, of being really meticulous to notice, like, what is really the difference for me? And that's always been a big one. Sort of the judgment mind that's critiquing the self during the experience gets turned down.
Is that the only kind of yoga that you're teaching now?
No.
You're doing all different kinds, and integrated and not integrated. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really, it's been interesting sort of representing cannabis and yoga over the last, since I opened the studio in 2017, because, there's sort of misperceptions of people like, oh, you're you smoke weed, you must smoke weed every day, or do you ever practice without it? Or are you a stoner? There's just a lot of confusion, I think, within our world about use of substances as a whole and drug use. And yeah, I fully enjoy practicing without the influence of cannabis, and I encourage my students to do that too, and other teachers. I don't, because I've been sort of creating spaces for people to do this and educating about it, and in some ways promoting it. It's not to say that I believe that we should always use cannabis in our yoga practices. So, yeah.
How do you share your messaging? Who are you corresponding with in the public, and what's the perception in your community, and what kind of pushback do you face? I'm assuming probably not a lot of adversity in what you're doing, but where are there perceptions to clear up? Where are there ways for you to present that are positively informing for people?
So when we first opened the studio, there was a lot of excitement and curiosity. Cannabis was being recreationally legalized the following year in 2018 here in California. And initially, just a lot of curiosity, excitement. This is new, it's novel. We got, some press in Rolling Stone and New York Times and like some different, people being like, what are they doing over there? What is this? And definitely a little pushback of, I remember getting an email once from a yoga instructor in New York who has been practicing for, 30 plus years. And he was livid. Like he was like, you're disrespecting the entire lineage of yoga by teaching this, by offering this. So we've gotten a little bit of that here and there, which I think is understandable. And, I get where they're coming from. But yeah, I think a big part of what I have taught over the last years within Lit Yoga is putting cannabis back into the realm of herbalism. And when you look back at history, kind of as Western medicine started to get, very popularized and schools were being provided for doctors to be educated, all the schools that were teaching herbalism and herbal medicine and hands-on healing and alternative methods of healing were getting shut down. And it's interesting that cannabis has become, it's gotten a lot of attention, so to say, in the last years. And it's a plant. At the end of the day, it has psychoactive properties. So it sort of fits into the field of psychedelics as well. But it's really a plant with certain benefits, certain, aspects to it of this wouldn't be a good fit for someone. So I think a big sort of misperception is that, because this is being offered, it's like this is the right fit for everyone, and it's not true. And there's a lot of plants that can be used to change your state of consciousness in a much milder way than cannabis. Damiana, for example, is a plant that has some aphrodisiac-like qualities, maybe even some like very low-key psychoactive properties to it. There's just a handful of other plants that affect our body, our mind. And so for me, it was like, how do we put cannabis back into the family of plants, of herbalism? And in the same way we do in herbalism, I wouldn't recommend that you take every plant that's out there. We would look at sort of your constitution, your natural aspects, and based on that, certain plants are going to be a better fit for you than others. So cannabis isn't the one for everyone, but for the people that it is for, it can be an incredible medicine and really support that person.
Did you ever engage that particular doctor any further, the one that was being immediately critical in New York? Was there anything that came out of it that you found to be of benefit in the end?
I think I ended up writing back to him and just kind of thanking him for sharing his perspective. What I did appreciate about it, because this was early on in my process of sharing this information, is that it forced me to learn more and dive deeper, more into the history of yoga and into the history of cannabis and the presence of the cannabis sativa plant in India thousands and thousands of years ago, being used medicinally and otherwise for spiritual connection or altered states in the way that we use it today. So yeah, it was a nice nudge of like, go figure out more if you're going to be speaking to these things, really understand it from the inside out.
Yeah. So do me a favor and tell me the origins of yoga. We trace that to India, and the practice came about how?
There's many different lineages, so it's hard to kind of pinpoint exactly, but there are books written on yoga, the Yoga Sutras, thousands of years ago from different spiritual teachers that, were showing these different practices to their communities.
It was always a spiritual practice?
So for them, and I think for many ancient cultures, it's not so separated in the way that we separate things today. Like today we'll say like mind, body, and spirit. And I don't yes, there were those distinguishing pieces, but for them, I think they saw things in a much more holistic perspective. So yeah, there was definitely more of maybe a spiritual component Asanas, which is the physical poses that people practice in yoga today, is one piece of the whole kind of philosophy and theory of yoga. So it's one of 8 pieces. And so it's interesting in Western, the way that we've kind of taken yoga into the West, asana, or the physical practices, have gotten the most, hype in a lot of ways. But that's a very small piece when you actually go back and look at how people were working with these practices in the past.
Why does it resonate for you so much? Why do you think you're drawn to being in this world?
I think I like things that are taboo as a whole, or anything that has felt like it's been misinterpreted in our modern world, or anything that we have strong judgments towards, or even legal, limitations towards. I like to kind of poke holes at all of those aspects and get curious about why and what's under it, and what are the aspects that are actually maybe potentially really beneficial and healing for the pieces of our world that seem chaotic and not well in a lot of ways.
What do you think is what are we talking about when we talk about mental health? It's a term that we use, and like you said, we separate it from physical health, maybe even from spiritual health. But what do you think is meant by mental health, and where does that show up in our lives?
For me, it's not separate. So I like to use the term BodyMind, which comes from some trainings that I've done in a modality called BodyMind centering. There's a woman, Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen, who started all of that. She was an occupational therapist for years and started working with her clients in sort of a unique, non-traditional way, and ended up getting fired for it, and kind of, it was like not accepted. But then she sort of went on to create her entire body of work based on the things that she was doing with people that were healing them. And so the body-mind approach is that there's not mental health and then physical health and then spiritual health. It's all one piece. And the more integrated those different pieces are, like, health means wholeness. So the more that we find integration in all of those. So I think there's definitely like a heavy focus on mental health where we're at in our world right now. And I think a big piece of that is a major disconnect from the body. And so people are almost like trapped in their own minds of their anxious thoughts or their depressive states that they can't get out of because they're not using the body as the vehicle to make those changes.
Are you a naturally empathetic and compassionate person?
I think so.
Do you think that's a requisite of most yoga teachers?
I think it shows up often, but I wouldn't say it's like across the board.
Yeah. Talk to me about herbalism more, because it feels like something that it feels ancient, but aspirin is essentially a mutation of herbalism, right? Or a version of variation.
Totally.
Where are people getting into herbalism in new ways now? How is it becoming something that's more, people are better acquainted with, or where is it being introduced?
Yeah, there's a beautiful resurgence happening right now, and it's really nicely aligned with sort of the psychedelic resurgence that's taking place. There's a lot more herbalism schools throughout the U.S. And across the world where people can go and study and learn about these things. So I think we're seeing it there, and then we're also seeing it sort of in our like food industry and wellness industry, in terms of superfoods or, medicinal mushrooms like lion's mane that are good for your brain, or people are getting little doses of it through supplements or things like that. So yeah, it's definitely coming back. But again, I think there's still a large disconnect and some misperceptions about the true potency of plants and how intelligent they are. They're living beings to a certain degree, just like we are. And so they have immune systems. They have like very similar, they can breathe. They can, like, there's just so much overlap to the human experience in terms of what plants are capable of. And they work synergistically with our bodies. So, the more Western medicine approach of you have a symptom, we're going to give you this thing to treat the symptom, and then the symptom goes away, so you're good. Whereas herbs work with imbalances. So we're treating more of the root cause or the imbalance that's occurring in the body. And the herb will help move you in one direction or another, whether it's through your hormone system, nervous system, all the different parts of the body. So it's a much more, like, I always like to call it, it's like slow medicine. Like, we're always looking for kind of the fast medicine, the quick fix. Having a relationship to plants and using them for our health is like slow medicine, but it's the way to kind of like that long, happy, healthy life where it's like this beautiful arc of you're just kind of always repairing and refining, as opposed to, for I think a lot of folks, it's like you probably feel really good when you're young and then maybe in your 20s, and then like people start to have their health conditions and like sometimes really plummet at certain points, and then you're kind of like, trying to recover from that. So I think the more that we can have a daily practice connected to our well-being, then we're just always kind of tweaking and refining things over a period of time. I've been studying through an herbal school that's up in Northern California for the last few years. And they have an incredible garden. Being able to spend time up there harvesting, learning, collecting seeds, making herbal medicine. I mean, that's been a huge healing journey for me to kind of reconnect to earth in that way and recognize that as I can tend to it and it can tend to me in that reciprocal relationship. If I haven't spent time outside in a couple of days, like, I don't feel well. And I think, that kind of leads into another piece of kind of our societal sicknesses. Like, we spend a lot of time inside. Most people are pretty depleted in terms of vitamin D and just sort of fresh air and all those good things. But yeah, as much as I can, getting on hikes and just spending hours at a time being outside. I recently, so I'm still living here in Los Angeles, but I recently got a place up in Northern California and have been spending more time. It's kind of like a little cabin up in the redwood trees, and being able to spend more time up there and taking more breaks from being in a city, given that I grew up in one and have lived in cities pretty much my whole life, has been very therapeutic. And nature's wild. Like, recently we had storms in the Bay Area. Yeah. And I was in my little cabin. I have a skylight that I can look out through the top, and these massive redwood trees are like, perfectly surrounding the whole cabin. And it was storming, lightning, thunder, rain, high winds. And I felt so small in that moment. I was looking up at the trees like it would not take that much for one of these trees to just, come onto my home. And I think that nature in that way humbles us and sort of reminds us like that we aren't in control of all of this. And I think that alone can be really healing for people, because a lot of people run around their whole life feeling like they're fully in control of everything, or as if they should be. And I think a lot of that sort of trust and surrender can soften people and actually open them up, which is healing in itself.
Would you share with us maybe one or two of the most influential psychedelic experiences that you've had?
Yeah, there's been quite a few. I had an experience the year after my mom died. so I started to explore psychedelics quite a bit around the time that she was sick.
You sought them out?
I did, yeah.
Mushrooms?
Mushrooms, and LSD I was exploring for the first time. And prior to her dying, I felt them to be really supportive. I feel like they put a lot in perspective for me during that time that she was sick. And I was able to kind of process some of what was happening in that period. And then the year after she died, I was going to do LSD more in a like recreational setting in some ways with friends.
A party, a hangout.
Yeah, it was New Year's Eve. It was an event in San Francisco, and there was some part of me that was like, I don't think I should do this. Like, I don't know that I'm in a place where this is going to be a positive experience, or what I deem to be a positive experience. And I feel like this was my real first like learning with psychedelics that, essentially I ended up taking LSD, had a very strange night overall. Like I just couldn't really drop into my own essence. Was feeling very like, just feeling kind of everyone else's energies quite a bit. And then later that night, went back to a friend's house, and I ended up kind of isolating myself in a room and like kind of was deep in a process and was feeling
This is a trip that's ongoing.
Yeah, this is like towards the end of it. Yeah. And I was really wanting it to end at that point. I was not having a great experience, or I was quite uncomfortable. And I was feeling a lot of fear, and death kept coming up for me. And sort of my mom's death, but more like my own death. Mm-hmm. And I was, I remember like closing my eyes, and I was like, just wanting to run from all of it. I was like, I don't want to feel any of this. This is awful and scary. But it felt sort of like I came out of it and I was fine, and, I didn't die. And it took me a long time to really integrate that, because at that time, my education around psychedelics, or how people were talking about these things, even in our culture, was very different. I was 22 at the time. So for me, it was like, that was a bad trip. Write it off as a bad trip. Like, ooh, maybe I shouldn't be experimenting with these things. Mm-hmm. But looking back, it was actually really incredible in some ways, because I wasn't fully prepared to kind of sit with my own death or mortality in that moment, but I did, and I saw it. I sort of felt like I was going to die.
Can you elaborate on that, please? Yeah, because I think that's something that comes up, and it's one of the most terrifying aspects of the whole proposition.
Yeah, I remember I kept closing my eyes, and I was seeing skeletons. I was seeing like skulls and skeletons, and I don't know if that was just my own representation of like what death meant, was like a skull, or like, kind of our symbols that exist in our world to associate those things. But I remember seeing that every time I closed my eyes, and I kept opening my eyes. I was like, oh my God, that's horrifying. But overall, I just sort of felt this like kind of dark, heavy energy. I remember my breath felt really inconsistent. Like I was kind of like, am I going to be able to keep breathing kind of feeling. And I now do more work in sort of the death and grief space. And I do think that was some type of initiation for me, like looking back on it 10 years ago. I think that it's a real gift to be able to sit with our own mortality and not lose our shit, and not, have no capacity to be able to be with those things, because it's the only guarantee that we have in this life. And whether it's going to be our own death or other people's death that we love in our life, our ability to hold that, I think, is deeply connected to our ability to live and our ability to love. And my experience with grief through my mom dying has shown me that full on, that the more I can really feel the grief of her loss and be with those dense emotions, like they're heavy, they're dense. You can, on an energetic level, like it's a lot to navigate in moments. But the more that I've allowed myself to lean into that and feel those things, the more I find joy and the more I'm in a state of love and openness. And I think it's two sides of the same coin, and they're deeply connected. And so I think it's unfortunate that we have created a culture that's, kind of going back to like the taboos. I think I'm like consistently drawn to these areas of life that feel like, let's rewrite this script. Let's rewrite this narrative around how we approach these things. Because I think a lot of people are afraid of death, and a lot of people don't know how to handle death when you say someone died. Like, people get so weird. They have no idea how to navigate it. And I think that, it's just a huge missed opportunity within, talk about healing. Like, I think us being able to actually make amends with death or have a relationship with it prior to it happening is one of the keys to our own vitality and to our own life.
Mm-hmm. The fact that there's so much mourning and grief involved with death has always been troubling for me, because it's supposed to be dogmatically the access into the unbelievable greatness,
right.
And I understand like missing someone, not being around what you're used to, but it sure seems to me like it would be a more humane world, or a more compassionate world, if we celebrated death differently, if we were able to come together and change our tone for what that means, And I think there's like, I always come back to this like reverential agnosticism, like, just surrendering to never being able to know, but sort of trying to do so lovingly. And I think that people look to teachers as people, maybe they look to teachers as people who have learned through discipline to hold that space, to be anchored in both those spaces. When you had the experience that you alluded to earlier at the end of the night, and you're seeing the skeletons, and it's an awareness of death or impermanence or whatever the manifestation was for you, there was probably a night where it was a much different tone, or a day where it was a much different tone with LSD in particular, right? Would you tell me about an experience that was opposite of that potentially, and why do you think it happens that some moments are like that and some moments are not?
Specific to LSD, I did sort of step back from exploring with that particular substance after that experience for some time, and years later started working with ayahuasca in much more contained ceremonial contexts. There was someone that I worked with for a handful of years who did body work while working with ayahuasca. So it was a little bit different than maybe a more traditional ayahuasca ceremony, where usually you're in a group setting and it's at night. But I was working with him. We would drink the medicine in the morning. I would be on like a chiropractic or massage table. And he would do hands-on body work kind of as you're in the experience. I had some incredibly profound moments working with ayahuasca in that way that were very light-filled, allowed me to process my mom's death in a very deep way and understand that was her path. Without going into like too much detail, kind of in the clarity that came through, it felt like a lot of my grief got to be alleviated through those moments. And sort of the fear of death that was so associated with that LSD experience started to get kind of broken up. Like it was like the fear around death or her death or my own death or anyone's death held less and less weight through those experiences. And I would, it's hard to sometimes translate psychedelic experiences into words. And I think sometimes it even does it a disservice because it is such an embodied, energetic experience. But I will say that sort of the opposite of that dense feeling that we all feel, related to certain emotions, heaviness, the denseness, like stagnancy, it's the opposite of that. It feels like flowing water or like light being able to move through the body. In Chinese medicine, it's qi. Like in yoga, it's called prana. It's like that, it exists. There's energy that we can't see. And so, yeah, I had a lot of really positive experiences in the years following that helped integrate that experience and give me a really different side of it. And, in psychedelic therapy, there's a huge piece around set and setting that's talked about quite a bit, which is that the environment that you're in is going to have an influence on your psychedelic experience, and your intention, the context to which you're going into that experience, your state of being in the days leading up to it, all of that is going to play a role. And I knew that with the LSD experience. Like I had a strong intuitive feeling of like, this is not going to feel good. And I did it anyway. But yeah, I don't think that bad trips are necessarily always, the worst thing. Like if you have the right container or, support system or resiliency to kind of work through those bad trips, I think sometimes they can be really impactful and really important teachers. But I also don't recommend that everyone push themselves through those, because depending on where you're at, what tools you have available to you, the support system in your life, that could be really potentially traumatic and harmful for people.
What do you think is happening in the ayahuasca experience? Are we opening up portals to other dimensions where extra dimensional entities are experiencing us and we're experiencing them?
Maybe yes, maybe no. I do think that there are other dimensions to a certain extent. And when you open up new fields of awareness and new states of consciousness, you can dabble in those other realms that normally we're quite blind to. I very much relate to the phrase of psychic surgery. That's been my experience over and over again. And what that feels like is almost like there is a being or an energy, or even like it's very earthy. I mean, it's a plant, like it's a vine. It has that snake-like, vine-like energy. And when you drink the medicine, in my experience, it does feel almost like there's a snake going through every little curve and crevice of my entire mind and my body, and any area where it gets stuck, it's like, oh, what's this block? And so coming back to sort of that idea of like chi or prana, we want things to be moving and flowing. And that's how, when you think of like a body of water where there's not a lot of flow, like a pond or something, it's going to get
stagnant.
Yes. So it gets murky, and that's where cells aren't getting to clean themselves out as easily. And then potentially, disease can come into the body. And so, yeah, I feel like it's very much this surgical experience. And I've felt that to such a detail where it's like, in the state, like you're lying down and it's like, okay, maybe memories or things are kind of coming up, and, it's like, okay, this is all like flowing. And then all of a sudden it feels like you kind of hit a wall, and maybe it's one particular memory from when you were 4 years old and this thing happened, or maybe even a memory of something that doesn't even quite feel like it happened in your lifetime. Or like, oh, an emotion that I can feel that like my father experiences, or like it can be like quite out there, but
Yeah.
it will become sort of this like wall. And then it's like almost like everything starts to contract or close up. And so in that moment, I feel like so much of the teaching of ayahuasca, is forgiveness, is compassion, is being able to understand sort of the human condition and all the trials and tribulations that humans go through, and, you know, why we hurt each other, why we lie, why we steal, why we hide things, why we're violent, why, you know, all those pieces that like can cause harm potentially. Ayahuasca sort of shines this light and is like, yeah, that's part of this. That's part of the human experience. And the more we can accept that that is part of it and offer forgiveness, like it's almost like it disappears, because it's only holding up space or stagnancy when we haven't let it soften or accepted it, if that makes any sense. Being in relationship of any sort is complex. And I think for me, what I've always come back to is the more that I know myself, the more that I know my intentions or what I'm bringing to the table, or where I'm at, and the more clear I can be in that and really come from that authentic, genuine place within myself, and sometimes even vulnerable place, that's the invitation to be met there. Doesn't mean that people always will be able to, and it doesn't mean that I'll always be able to show up in that way. But for the moments that I'm not able to, or someone else isn't able to, I think that's where we get to bring in the forgiveness. And kind of as I was saying before, I think the self-forgiveness is a big piece of it, because we will mess up. You know, we will stumble, we will make mistakes and say things we don't mean, or hurt other people, or invite hurt, you know, through how we're behaving in relationships. And I like to remind myself and others that, again, like almost similar to, you know, the disembodiment or the lack of, you know, understanding around death and how we navigate grief. Like these things are not taught. We're not taught how to be in healthy relationships for the most part in our world. We're witnessing it through our parents, or, you know, as a child, what you're seeing in your world. And I think we're in this really interesting time in history where people are waking up to more self-awareness than maybe we have in some time, because we have the ability to, in some ways. Like enough is sort of stabilized to a certain degree. Not that our world is stable, but it's almost like a privilege, or even just, I don't know, so much has been sort of automated to some degree in our world, or even thinking about our parents, or our parents' parents, what they had to navigate in the day-to-day to have food on the table and manage. And I'm not saying this is across the board for everyone, but I think that there's more of an ability to start to, you know, lean into these spiritual realms, or realms of consciousness or awareness, and have more, be a little bit more in sovereignty and autonomy over how we're showing up. And I think that's why tools like meditation and, breath work, even, because it helps kind of change your state of being. Like the more that we have the ability to change our state in the moment, like catch yourself in a moment of, okay, I'm getting really angry right now. Like heat is rising in my body. I can feel my heart rate speeding up. My breath is irregular. When we start to notice those somatic or embodied responses, and then there's just that little bit of space to go, okay, this is what's coming up for, like this is the self-awareness. This is what's happening for me. And I'm not just going to react from that embodied, sense of overwhelm, essentially.
Yeah.
In terms of relational experiences and how we interact with each other, I think that starts to be sort of the gateway of like changing, some of those dynamics, and not sort of just people being in such reactionary states where you're just kind of lashing out from very old patterns of fear.
It's quite a triumph to catch that before it gets out of hand.
Yeah. It's a skill that can be learned. I mean, I think some people are probably born into this world that have a little bit of an easier time being in that calm state, or being less reactive or less impulsive. And then other people, that's harder.
Yeah.
But I think, if you just start to create that little bit, it's like a space between the synapses in the brain. And I do think psychedelics are another way to do that, because what happens, they call it sort of like the default mode network, kind of like what we were talking about very at the beginning of like altered states of consciousness. It's like, okay, well, your normal waking state of consciousness is the default mode network, where you're just, you're in your habits. You're just kind of like, the brain is just doing what it's been trained to do for a long time. And with psychedelics, even like ketamine assisted therapy is becoming a lot more accessible now. And I was reading some research recently on how that, working with ketamine basically turns off the default mode network. And it's why for some people that can feel really scary, because that's your only sense of reality when, just that habitual way of being. But even if you turn that off, ketamine's a very short experience, maybe 5-10 minutes that you're sort of under the influence of it. And just for that short amount of time to be able to turn that off and then come back on. I mean, it's like unplugging your computer and plugging it back in. It's like we just need to have those opportunities to reset sometimes, so that you're not so in your shit,
If somebody wanted to step out of their shit for a moment and step into your shit in a teaching environment, a class structure, how would they go about getting acquainted with the community that you oversee?
So just due to the last couple of years with pandemic and everything, we don't have a whole lot of public classes happening right now. I think in the near future that will change. I work with people one-on-one, so they can connect with me that way. And then our lit yoga teacher training is available virtually. So this is a training that was done in Los Angeles, New York, and then virtually during the last couple of years. So we've done that training about 10 times. We've had about 100 people go through it. And now it's available self-paced online. So people can go in, and you don't have to be a yoga teacher to take it. It covers a lot of this information. We look at herbalism, different plants, their benefits, different psychedelics, all the yoga components. Being able to take that training online is a really nice way to kind of tap into what we're doing, and you will be added to our community platforms. We have like an online platform where teachers that have done the training and those that are currently going through it get to talk and chat about all these weird topics and connect into community that way.
Hannah, thanks for coming on and sharing your knowledge with us today. I hope that you felt like we touched on some things that could be of help to others. My aspiration is always that somebody could find this information and find it applicable, be heartened by the conversation in some way. So I enjoyed meeting you and feeling like you would be somebody who could hold this kind of space with me. And so I appreciate your time very much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me.